In today's video, we're counting down 6 of the most disturbing tourist deaths ever caught in real-life tragedies. From a quiet dinner that ended with an 80-foot fall, to a glacier cave collapse that crushed a hiker beneath tons of ice. These incidents are a reminder that beauty and danger often share the same view. It was September 17, 2016. Wind tore through Vernazza as waves slammed the cliffs below. At a clifftop restaurant, tourists sat for dinner, unaware how close they were to the edge of the view and of danger. Donna Carpenter, a 58-year-old retired hospice nurse from Madison, Wisconsin, had spent 3 decades beside dying patients, offering comfort few could sustain. She'd postponed her own dreams to care for others, first her clients, then her husband through his final illness. After he passed, Donna finally made plans she'd deferred for years. This Italian journey was her first real vacation in decades. Friends described her as the type who booked every ticket and hotel 6 months in advance. She'd studied guidebooks obsessively, researched each destination, and planned every detail of her Cinque Terre adventure. That evening, she'd joined a guided group dinner at the Clifftop restaurant, an add-on event promising authentic local cuisine with panoramic ocean views. The trattoria seemed charming, weathered stone tables, flickering candles, and breathtaking vistas of the darkening sea. But locals had been warning tour operators about dangerous conditions. High winds had battered the coast for days, weakening terrace walls and destabilizing cliff paths. Several diners questioned the weather that evening. The restaurant host dismissed their concerns, insisting the winds were typical and the stone railings had held for years. Donna chose a table at the terrace's outer edge, drawn by the open view. The stone wall in front of her looked solid, weathered but dependable. At first glance, there seemed to be no reason to question it. By dessert, wind gusts intensified dramatically. Multiple witnesses reported a powerful blast sweeping across the terrace, lifting tablecloths and sending silverware clattering. A wine glass toppled toward the edge. Donna instinctively stood to catch it, her left foot stepping into loose gravel scattered beneath the table. The gravel gave way instantly. Donna's feet slid out from under her and her lower back slammed the stone wall with a sickening thud. She tipped backward over the edge, arms flailing, and vanished. A dull, wet crack echoed seconds later from the rocks below. Blood splattered up the cliff face. There was no time to react. A man at the adjacent table lunged desperately but missed. Guests screamed as staff members rushed to the wall, shouting into the howling wind. The slope dropped nearly 80 feet to jagged rocks below. Rescue workers found Donna's body wedged in a narrow crevice, her neck and spine shattered by the devastating fall. Italian authorities immediately sealed the restaurant's clifftop dining area. Structural inspections revealed multiple safety violations. The stone wall was below legal height, and no proper anchoring barriers had been installed. They faced heavy fines and forced closure of its cliffside operation. Donna's daughter arrived in Vernazza 2 days later to claim her mother's body. The woman who had faced death professionally for 30 years had met her own in a moment of preventable tragedy, alone on vacation behind a wall that should have been higher. It was March 4, 2017. Low clouds pressed against the Juneau ice field as light drizzle fell on the trail leading to Mendenhall Glacier. Beneath the surface, melting ice caves still glowed blue, but the thaw had already started. Daryl Coe, a 41-year-old software engineer from San Jose, California, stood among a group of 8 preparing to enter the glacier's most famous ice cave. In his spare time, Daryl was a dedicated outdoor photographer with hundreds of landscape images published on amateur sites, and a methodical checklist of national parks to conquer. Relatives knew him as quiet, observant, and cautious, the type who researched trail conditions, gear requirements, and optimal lighting angles before every expedition. Daryl preferred solo travel, often saying it eliminated delays and missed photographic opportunities. Alaska had topped his bucket list for years, and these ethereal blue ice caves represented the crown jewel of his week-long solo adventure. He carried his lightweight tripod and mirrorless camera, ready to capture the otherworldly beauty he'd studied in countless online galleries. However, heavy rainfall had pounded the glacier the previous day, increasing surface runoff and weakening ice structures. Still, the licensed tour operator continued with the scheduled cave visit, citing pressure to meet bookings and a lack of official closure orders. 2 guides led the group inside, where centuries-old compressed snow filtered light into shifting shades of cobalt and blue. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling as the group moved deeper inside. One guide reportedly mentioned the ice felt soft today, but they continued the tour. Daryl trailed slightly behind, adjusting his camera settings to capture long exposure shots of the glowing chamber. As the group prepared to exit, disaster struck without warning. A sharp crack echoed through the cavern, followed by a deep, ominous groan. One tourist later described the sound as a tree trunk snapping underwater. Then came a thunderous crash as a massive section of the cave's inner ceiling collapsed catastrophically. The falling ice slab was roughly the size of a van, dislodging in one devastating piece. Daryl stood directly beneath it. The impact was instantaneous and fatal. Witnesses screamed as tons of fractured ice pinned Daryl to the cave floor. One guide collapsed in shock while the other frantically called for emergency assistance via satellite phone. A rescue helicopter was dispatched immediately, arriving within minutes, but there was nothing left to save. Only Daryl's hand protruded from the massive pile of ice and debris. Recovery attempts were deemed too dangerous due to continued cave instability. Authorities suspended all glacier cave tours for 3 weeks, implementing new safety protocols and access restrictions. Daryl's body was finally recovered after a controlled excavation 2 days later. Local authorities and park officials investigated the incident and interviewed the guides and surviving tourists. The tour company was cited for safety violations. Daryl's ashes were returned to California, with a portion later scattered in Yosemite, his favorite park. Friends gathered for a quiet memorial in San Jose, displaying framed photographs from his adventures. It was October 11th, 2018. The afternoon heat in Marrakesh had begun to fade, but the Medina pulsed with relentless energy. In the souks, vendors shouted over bright stalls as spice and exhaust filled the narrow air. Down a lesser-known alley, unmarked on any tourist map, a group of travelers had taken a turn that would change everything. Cole Hampton, a 24-year-old ventilation system apprentice from Winnipeg, Canada, was exploring with 2 high school friends during their 2-week budget adventure through Morocco and Tunisia. Cole was the group's natural leader, outgoing, fearless, and always eager to connect with locals. He prided himself on avoiding tourist traps, constantly seeking the authentic experience that guidebooks couldn't provide. Friends relied on him to negotiate prices, navigate cultural barriers, and diffuse tense situations with his infectious humor. Cole had spent weeks researching Moroccan culture, learning basic Arabic phrases, and studying local customs. Marrakesh's chaotic energy and winding souks represented exactly the kind of immersive experience he craved. His Instagram showed countless photos of genuine interactions with locals, always respectful but unafraid to venture beyond designated tourist zones. That afternoon, while searching for an authentic carpet to send home as a gift, the trio wandered off the main souk into a dimly lit side alley. A merchant, recognizing their interest, beckoned them behind his stall, promising superior selections hidden from casual browsers. Several locals warned them softly. "Not for tourists," one muttered. But Cole grinned. He had always trusted his gut over vague warnings, and the chance to find something rare felt worth the risk. He figured the locals were just being protective or trying to steer them towards safer, pricier shops. The back area was cramped with uneven stone floors. Beyond the carpet rolls and cluttered shelves, a narrow service corridor opened up, used by merchants for loading deliveries and storage. According to 2 nearby vendors, a heavily loaded donkey cart was slowly reversing down that tight passage. The cart groaned under crates of ceramic tagine pots, while its young handler, distracted by a phone conversation, guided the animal carelessly. As Cole and his friends examined carpets behind the stall, one friend cracked a joke that sent Cole into laughter. Still chuckling, he stepped backward without looking, his boot striking a loose wooden crate. He stumbled, losing his balance and falling directly into the path of the approaching cart. The donkey startled violently, spooked by the sudden movement and clattering wood, and lurched forward with devastating force. The cart's heavy wooden axle crushed Cole's torso against the stone wall with a sickening impact. Witnesses described hearing a wet thud followed immediately by his friend's horrified screams. Blood pooled rapidly on the dusty ground as Cole collapsed without a word, his chest catastrophically crushed. One vendor ran for help, while another desperately held the panicked donkey's reins. Police arrived within minutes, cordoning off the area and arresting both the merchant and cart operator for criminal negligence. Local authorities confirmed tourists were never supposed to access the service corridor, especially during active cart operations. The narrow passage lacked proper safety barriers or warning signs, but did nothing after the incident. Cole's parents flew to Morocco 2 days later to identify his body and arrange repatriation. His funeral was held in the small hockey rink where he'd once played goalie, drawing hundreds of mourners, family, friends, and former teammates who remembered his curiosity, humor, and generous heart. It was November 3, 2016. The Victoria Nile glistened under late morning sun as an aluminum tour skiff glided silently through Murchison Falls National Park. Tourists leaned forward with cameras raised, hushed by their guide's stern warnings. In this stretch of river, silence wasn't just respectful, it was survival. Jeremy Fields, a 37-year-old produce wholesaler from Flagstaff, Arizona, had finally taken his first real vacation as an adult. A single father of 2 boys, he'd booked this 10-day East African adventure on impulse. A birthday gift to himself, featuring safaris, hiking, and river tours. Friends described Jeremy as athletic and good-humored, but known for dismissing what he called nervous energy. He respected rules but bristled at being told what not to do. Jeremy wasn't reckless by nature, just confident. He'd researched Uganda extensively, reading about wildlife encounters and safety protocols. But like many first-time visitors to Africa, he underestimated the lethal reality behind the postcard scenery. His social media showed typical tourist excitement, photos of elephants, landscapes, and smiling selfies with local guides. That morning, Jeremy boarded a mid-sized skiff with 12 other tourists, Americans, British, and Germans, plus a local Ugandan guide and boat operator. Their route followed the Victoria Nile toward the legendary Murchison Falls. As they approached a shaded inlet, the guide delivered quiet but firm instructions. Remain seated, stay silent, and avoid startling hippos at all costs. The group nodded obediently as cameras were lifted quietly, but Jeremy wanted something more dramatic, footage that would impress friends back home. As the skiff drifted within view of a half-submerged hippo herd, he stood slowly and raised his phone to record. Then he whistled sharply, trying to provoke a reaction. Someone hissed, "Don't!" Jeremy ignored them, clapping loudly and laughing as he attempted to make the hippos lift their heads or yawn for his video. The guide spun around, ordering him to sit down immediately. Jeremy refused. Without warning, a massive bull hippo exploded from beneath the surface just 20 feet from the port side. Witnesses described it as a missile from nowhere. The animal's jaws clamped onto the boat's edge with devastating force, sending a thunderous crack across the water. The vessel lurched violently, throwing Jeremy backward into the murky river. Passengers screamed as the guide grabbed his rifle. Jeremy surfaced, coughing and paddling desperately against the current. But within seconds, the enraged hippo returned with lethal intent. It charged from below, jaws opening impossibly wide, and bit down across Jeremy's chest and torso in one crushing motion. One witness saw his upper body lift violently from the water before disappearing in a churning swirl of red. The guide fired a warning shot skyward. The hippo submerged. Jeremy never resurfaced. Called by the native guides, park rangers arrived within an hour, but recovery efforts proved futile. 3 hours later, partial remains, his left leg and shredded clothing, were found downstream. Rangers issued renewed safety bulletins warning of the extreme territorial aggression of Nile hippos and the importance of remaining seated and quiet during river tours. The park also began requiring all boat operators to complete updated wildlife hazard training before leading tourist excursions. Jeremy's body was flown home to Arizona in a sealed casket. His sons, aged 9 and 11, were told there had been an accident. A small memorial was held in Flagstaff, attended by friends and family who remembered his adventurous spirit. It was June 22, 2015. The night air in Tainan, Taiwan pulsed with thundering drums, exploding firecrackers, and thick clouds of incense. Villagers packed narrow roads around a rural temple, their faces glowing crimson from flame arcs overhead. It was a purification ceremony, colorful, deafening, and that night, catastrophically overloaded. Harriet Ngo, a 33-year-old dental hygienist from Perth, Australia, had recently ended a long-term relationship and embarked on a solo cultural journey through Southeast Asia. Reserved but adventurous, she was fascinated by Taiwan's layered traditions and vibrant street life. She avoided tourist resorts, preferring homestays to connect authentically with locals. She'd researched Taiwanese customs extensively, learning basic Mandarin phrases and studying festival traditions. Her Tainan Airbnb host, an elderly woman, had encouraged her to attend that evening's temple procession, a small neighborhood event tourists rarely discovered. Harriet brought her phone and shoulder bag, excited to photograph what she called the real Taiwan. The main attraction was the fire tunnel, a ceremonial walkway flanked by towering arches of sparklers, Roman candles, and fire fountains. Locals walked through barefoot or with wet towels draped over their heads, symbolically cleansing themselves through spiritual fire. Volunteers handed Harriet a damp towel and gestured for her to join the slow-moving procession line. The air was already thick with gunpowder haze as Harriet hesitated briefly, then stepped confidently under the first blazing arch. She'd likely witnessed similar rituals online and trusted the organizers' experience. What she didn't know was that safety had been compromised. Cheap wiring was used after a fuse repair, and crowd barriers had been removed to speed up foot traffic. In the context of informal or loosely regulated public events, especially in smaller towns or rural areas, this is unfortunately normal. And midway through the tunnel, an overhead launcher, mounted too low and catastrophically overloaded, burst off angle, sending a cluster of live shells directly into the crowd. One spark struck a man wearing a synthetic oil-stained jacket. Witnesses saw a sudden whoosh of flame as fire spread across his clothing. The man screamed and spun wildly into the procession, flames spreading from person to person like falling dominoes. Panic erupted instantly. People shoved and stumbled as firework tubes collapsed from their unstable mounts. Harriet, trapped near the tunnel's center, was caught in the human stampede. Someone slammed into her from behind with devastating force. She lost her footing and fell hard onto the concrete, her protective towel slipping away. As panicked crowds surged past, she was trampled repeatedly. A fallen spark ignited her cotton blouse, and within seconds her upper body was engulfed in flames. Eyewitnesses said she tried desperately to rise, one arm shielding her face from the inferno. Her screams pierced the tunnel but were lost in the roar of continuing fireworks. Several bystanders attempted rescue, but intense heat and the ongoing stampede made approach impossible. She stopped screaming after 20 seconds. Standby fire volunteers eventually extinguished the blaze with buckets of water and emergency blankets, but it was too late for Harriet. Her body was removed before dawn as authorities sealed the site and launched a criminal investigation. 2 volunteer firework handlers were arrested for gross negligence. Local news footage showed charred prayer flags and melted PVC frames, remnants of sacred tradition turned lethal. Harriet's remains were flown back to Australia in a sealed container due to the extent of her injuries. A closed casket funeral was held in Perth, with former patients and co-workers filling the small chapel to capacity. It was December 28, 2015. The sun dipped behind the horizon at Tanah Lot, casting gold across the sea and shadowing the ancient temple perched on its wave-carved rock. Tourists clustered along the shoreline with phones raised, mesmerized by the fading light. The tide was rising steadily, pushing waves closer to the narrow land bridge connecting the sacred temple to shore. Ethan Sanders, a 39-year-old warehouse supervisor from Missoula, Montana, stood with his wife Kara and their 2 sons, ages 10 and 12. This was his first overseas trip, a family vacation to Bali that he'd planned meticulously for months. Ethan had been fascinated by Balinese spirituality and water temples, particularly Tanah Lot's dramatic setting where ancient stone met relentless ocean. That day, as sunset approached, he spotted a lower rock shelf near the barrier rope, just close enough to capture the perfect shot of waves crashing against sacred stone. However, local staff had repeatedly warned visitors not to cross the marked boundary during high tide. Signs were posted in English and Indonesian, clearly marking dangerous zones. But at that time, the shelf likely appeared solid and dry enough for Ethan for a quick photo opportunity. Ethan glanced back at his family, mentioned getting a better angle, and stepped beyond the safety barrier. A nearby guide watched him climb down carefully, camera in hand, onto rocks slick with algae and ocean mist. The sea had been deceptively calm moments before. But then, a massive rogue wave, likely triggered by sudden underwater currents, surged toward shore with devastating force. Witnesses described it as a moving wall that struck faster and louder than anything they'd seen that evening. The wave hit the shelf broadside, sending thick spray and foam exploding skyward. Ethan was struck squarely in the chest by the crushing water. The impact knocked him flat and dragged him backward off the rocky ledge into churning ocean. Kara screamed as their sons froze in shock. Tourists shouted desperately while one local guide rushed down with a bamboo pole, but Ethan had already disappeared beneath the surface. For a terrifying moment, he reappeared floating face down between swells, completely motionless. Another massive wave crashed over him, and he vanished permanently into the violent churn beneath the rock ledges. A search team was dispatched within 30 minutes after being informed by the local witnesses. Rescuers and police used boats and spotlights, combing the treacherous shoreline well into the night. Divers finally located Ethan's body 2 hours later, wedged under a submerged rock shelf half a mile south. An autopsy confirmed massive blunt force trauma and drowning. Balinese authorities responded by stating that existing warnings had been clear and that tourists were responsible for respecting tide conditions. No changes were made to the site. The family flew home with Ethan's body 3 days later. His funeral in Missoula was small and heartbreaking. His sons placed coral stones they'd collected from the site on top of his grave, a final connection to the place that had claimed their father. Thanks for watching. If these real-life stories of beauty, risk, and sudden tragedy kept you hooked, click here for more.